So it's not just the workers who can change their willingness and ability to work or where they're working, what market they're in due to differentials in wages. Firms also react to that. So they can shift their labor demand. So we've seen this in the past with outsourcing over the last few decades, moving from production from, the United States to other countries where the cost of production is lower, but it's much older than that. So in the early 1900s, a lot of textile manufacturers moved south from New England to the southern US states because the workers in New England were relatively highly paid, especially compared to workers in the South who were more or paid less per hour. Because low-skilled workers command lower wages than higher-skilled workers, companies do have an incentive to try to figure out how to use lower-skilled employees in production. So here in the figures on this slide, we can see how changes in demand can reduce or eliminate wage disparities. So as the demand for low-wage workers, so that's market B, while market A is the market for high-skilled workers. So as the demand for low-wage workers increases in market B, so we shift the demand curve from D to D2, it's going to increase the wage that they command. And it's going to increase, again, the number of low-skilled employees that are able to find work at that wage. At the same time, firms are going to demand few higher-skilled workers. So their wages are going to fall, and then the demand curve is going to shift to the left. We see fewer higher-skilled workers being demanded by firms. Now, in the long run, this adjustment process depends on the ability for firms to substitute lower skilled workers for higher skilled workers. Now, it's not going to, like we see in this example, perfectly even out where the lower skilled workers have the same exact wage as the higher skilled workers. In practice, there's only so much substitution that firms can do for these lower skilled workers for higher skilled workers. So we don't expect adjustments in demand to completely eliminate the disparity in wages between these markets, A and B, in this case for higher versus lower skilled workers. But we may see it in some cases, like if we're looking at two nearby labor markets with slightly different costs of living. Over time, changes in demand may be able to completely eliminate the wage differential. But typically, especially if we're looking at things like skill-based wage differentials, we're not going to see enough changes in supply or demand to be able to completely take care of those, completely eliminate them. Although adjustments in supply or demand, by adjustments shifting the supply and demand curves, as we see graphically, although it can reduce the wage differences between markets, again, they're not often going to be enough to eliminate the differences between them. In the long run, we still experience a difference in wages between these markets, whether these markets are based on the skill of the employee, the education that they receive, the danger of the job, or other characteristics. These differences, if there's difference in the long run between the wages, odds are there's some characters of the jobs that are different enough that employees need to be compensated to work in these different jobs. So it may be that, for instance, salaries are higher in a place like Washington, D.C. than in a more rural place like Morgantown, West Virginia, or Altoona, Pennsylvania, for the same exact job or a very similar job. But this difference is going to be caused by the difference in the cost of living. That's much more expensive to live in Washington, D.C. than it is to live in, a place like Morgantown. We call this compensating differentials. So basically the additional amount of income that a given worker must be offered in order to motivate them to accept a given undesirable job relative to jobs that other workers could perform. So we typically use this concept for undesirable jobs. That's what, the definition typically is. It can also speak of, compensating differentials for a desirable job. So something that provides some sort of special benefits. If this is the case, workers are actually going to be paid less than a job with similar characteristics. Maybe it's things like the prestige associated with a job. Maybe it's flexible working hours that employees really appreciate, but they're actually willing to be paid less in order to get this job. But typically we think of it as a tough job, like I have the picture here of micro from dirty jobs, something that's either dangerous or something that people really don't like to do, they have to be paid more money to do it than just the characteristics of the job, like the education required, the skill level, how much money they actually bring in to the company, so the marginal revenue that they produce. So because of the cost of higher education, jobs that require specialized training that the employee has to pay for themselves are typically rewarded with higher wages. Again, because it's more expensive for the employee to pay to develop the skills that they need for that job, they end up being paid more for that job. They have to be compensated for that. And because all of economics is basically just a footnote to Adam Smith, who started off the field basically in 1776, he has an explanation for compensating differentials from way back when that still holds up today. And your textbook goes through and lists some of the examples Adam Smith actually gave in The Wealth of Nations about why compensating differentials exist in different situations where they do. So there has been some empirical work studying wage differentials. Your textbook has a section on that. This is the last thing we'll cover in chapter 7. So there are some interregional wage differentials, and the basic findings of the research, what was tended to find over the years, is that net in-migration, so migration into an area, is positively correlated with relative wages in a region. So people tend to move more to areas with higher wages. They move less to areas with lower wages. A net in-migration is negatively correlated with the unemployment rate. So if there's excess workers there that can be pulled out and enter the labor force if wages start to rise, there's a lot of those people around. People are less likely to move to the area as well. And finally, net in-migration is negatively correlated with the cost of moving. So it's more expensive to move somewhere, fewer people are going to go there. Again, the wage differential in the high cost of moving area has to be that much higher than other places to get people to be willing to move there. And all three of these findings are consistent with the model we talked about. Now, the other aspect that that textbook really looks into is job safety. So differences in wages should compensate for non-wage characteristics of the job. In this case, they're looking at job safety. There's a lot of other negative things. There could be negative, like a stigma associated with a job, or tends to have, I guess, lower status in the eyes of other people. Now, the jobs, you will need to pay workers more money to be willing to go into those jobs. So now, hedonic wage functions are basically the assumption that employees maximize their utility in job selection, outlined by the labor market. So basically, what that means in normal language is that the more undesirable a job is, the higher wages and employees are going to need to be compensated for working at that company. And what we tend to find is that workers in jobs with a higher risk of injury or death earn a premium over similar jobs without that high risk of injury or death.